we're going to do a quick spin of your personal journey, but then we want to hear some of your perspectives on what's going on in the world.
Okay, a lot.
A lot
is the short answer.
So, Chrystia, it's so fascinating that you were a journalist. You wrote a book called The Plutocrats. Was that a reference to some of the women in this room? Just kidding.
Possibly the most successful one.
But you were a very well-respected journalist and author, and you went into politics. What's been the hardest part of that?
Well, it's great to be here, Nina, and it's great to be at this conference, and it's great to be with so many wonderful women. My prime minister is a feminist, and we have a feminist foreign policy.
And he'll be there tonight.
And he will be here tonight. So this is great. Look, I still consider myself a recovering journalist. And your question reminds me of a moment. Actually, earlier this year, I was with the prime minister in Washington. And we had a meeting. And we walked out of the meeting, and I sort of clutched his arm, and I said, Prime Minister, that's a scoop. Nobody knows that. That is a fantastic story. And he looked at me a little concerned, and he said, you're not a journalist anymore. A lot of people tell us things nobody else knows. It's not a scoop.
What was the scoop? Tell us.
Of course I can't tell you.
We're in a cone of silence.
No, it's not a cone. Okay. I can't tell you. So look, I still, I loved being a journalist. It's great, by the way, to see journalists like you, news organizations like Fortune reinventing themselves for the 21st century and doing such great things. And in terms of how I became a politician and why, one person who is here, who some of you may have met, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, bears a lot of responsibility for that. She is a real feminist, and she and the Prime Minister, back when he was leader of the opposition, and we were at this point the third party in Parliament, very, very defeated. But the Prime Minister and Katie were already looking forward to winning in 2015 and thinking about the kind of government that they wanted to put together. And they felt very strongly they wanted to have a lot of women in government. In fact, the Prime Minister has a 50-50 gender-balanced cabinet. But their view was, we won't be able to do that unless we convince a lot of great women to run. And so I had gotten to know them a little bit. Actually, I met the Prime Minister at the book launch of Plutocrats in Toronto. I was living in New York at the time. And then a by-election, a seat came open in Canada. And the Prime Minister and Katie and Jerry, who is now his principal advisor, said to me, you need to quit your job and move your kids out of their schools and move back to Canada and run for this seat. And that was a big thing. And they worked very hard at convincing me. It was a big leap. I think, what they would tell you and what I now see being at the other side trying to recruit women, one thing the Prime Minister says about recruiting women to go into politics is the first thing a man says, if you say, I think you would be a great leader, you should run, is he says, what took you so long to ask me? And if you invite a woman, the first thing she says is, why me? And then what Katie will say, the second thing she says, and this was my case, is, where will my kids go to school? Yeah. But I really do credit them, and it's something that collectively we're trying to do, is to say, if you want women in leadership positions, you have to really focus on the pipeline. And speaking for myself and my own decision, I think you have to be willing to take risks. You have to be willing to put yourself out there. You have to be willing to maybe fail. One of the things I said to myself about choosing to run is I said, even if I lose, I will feel like trying was the right thing to do.
Great. So we have a short time. We're going to take a tour of the world, starting with Washington, D.C. There have been a lot of, the critics of the White House would say that this administration has stepped back from world leadership in a number of fronts. Do you feel like you're stepping up to the plate in any arenas?
I'm not a journalist anymore, and it is not my job to be a commentator or analyst of US politics. But speaking for Canada, what I can say is definitely, one of the things that the Prime Minister said, not this year, but last year at the United Nations, is Canada is back. And our government really believes that being fully engaged in the world is really, really important. And it's important partly because, you know, Canada, we're a G7 country. We're the 10th largest economy in the world, but there's only 36 million Canadians. And if we want a prosperous, safe future for all those Canadians, we need a world order that works. We need a rules-based world order. And so if we want that, we have to be really engaged in it. The other reason is Canadians really care. You know, one of the things that I have found to be the greatest pleasure as foreign minister is the number of people who, just Canadians I meet in my daily life, who really want us to be engaged. I'll give you a small example. On Sunday afternoon, I took my 8-year-old son to see Blade Runner. Very good, by the way, loved it. Canadian director.
Yeah.
Afterwards, we went to the bookstore in the same building. And the woman selling us the book said, "You look a lot like Chrystia Freeland." And I said, "Well, I am Chrystia Freeland." And she said, "Thank you for what you're doing on Venezuela." And it turned out she had immigrated to Canada from Venezuela. And you know, some people say that foreign policy doesn't matter as retail politics. In my own experience, I totally disagree.
Share what you're doing on Venezuela briefly.
So, you know, we feel, and I think, you know, a lot of Americans feel that what is happening in Venezuela is a collapse of democracy and an establishment of a dreadful dictatorship. The opposition is being imprisoned, is being intimidated. The parliament has been replaced by a constituent assembly. And we think that it's incredibly important for countries in the hemisphere to speak up against it. We have imposed targeted sanctions on the leadership of the Venezuelan regime. And on October 26th, Canada will be hosting a meeting of the Lima Group, which is a group of countries in the hemisphere that are really concerned about what's happening in Venezuela and trying to push for the restoration of democracy.
So beyond Venezuela, there's a lot of clouds on the national security front, and I know you don't want to be a commentator. However, you must have noticed the Twitter war going on in this country, and there was concern from a senator who happens to be the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that we are on the brink of World War III, and that was over the top, possibly rhetoric. But how concerned are you, and what are you most concerned about?
Look, there are a lot of things that are concerning in the world right now. I think that this is probably the most uncertain moment in sort of international relations since the end of the Second World War. You know, this
the
is
most uncertain moment since the end of
I think
World
so.
War II. Wow.
You know, I think we are seeing, you know, after World War II, we had this tremendous moment of building up the international institutions that governed the 70-plus years of post-World War II prosperity. You know, institutions like the GATT, followed by the WTO, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF. And these can sound like very boring and bureaucratic and stuff, but they have been the foundations of a world that, particularly for the transatlantic nations, has really worked, and which with time has embraced more and more people into a peaceful, prosperous world. It's been great, and that order is starting to fracture. And I think as a result, we're seeing tensions in lots of different places. North Korea, very clearly, that's something Canada is very concerned about. We're a Pacific nation as well.
Let's talk about North Korea. Is there any bright spot on that? There are some people who think that China's reaction to North Korea has actually evolved in the last many months. Maybe you feel differently.
No, I very much share that view. I do think that, and we have been working closely with the United States, with Secretary Tillerson, and I do think that China has been taking stronger steps relative to North Korea than it has for some time. The Chinese support for the Security Council resolutions is a very positive thing. And I think it's very important to build that sort of broad international support and to apply that pressure. I also think with North Korea, it's important to keep some lines of communication open. Ultimately, what I think the whole world needs is a diplomatic solution to the crisis there. And it is possible to have some conversations. We recently, we had a terrible case of a Canadian missionary who had been imprisoned in North Korea, Pastor Lim, and our national security advisor was recently able to travel to North Korea. We don't have diplomatic relations with them, but he was able to travel to North Korea and secure Pastor Lim's release. I spoke with the North Korean foreign minister about that in Manila in August. So, you know, we have to start building places where we can have dialogue, even as we apply serious pressure and say, this is not acceptable. You know, our countries are facing a threat, and we can't live with that.
What have President Trump's tweets, what has been the impact both on the dynamic with Korea and the uncertainty that you talked about earlier?
You know, I said, Nina, that my job here was not going to be to offer commentary on other countries' conduct of foreign policy. But let me say about North Korea. You know, I do think that, you know, going back to your question, you know, something that we have heard American diplomats speaking about, I think, is true. That we have seen a shift in the Chinese position. I spent quite a bit of time with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, in August, and China now wants to get to a solution there. I think we have to maintain the pressure, maintain the diplomacy, and build up some networks there. And again, you know, a very concrete example of where the Chinese are now playing a positive role is their support of those Security Council resolutions. And we have to remember that Chinese support is not just symbolic, because those Security Council resolutions chiefly have an impact on the Chinese relationship with North Korea. So having China involved is absolutely essential. I would be the last person to say this is a problem which is solved or that we are there yet. But I think some progress is being made, and we all just have to stay united and keep on pressing really, really hard. The one other thing, you know, sometimes when we talk about North Korea, we Canadians and Americans who now find ourselves, you know, maybe in striking distance of those missiles, can forget to mention the South Koreans. And they, of course, are the country the most exposed. I think it's very important to be working closely with that government, which obviously knows North Korea the best. We have a very good relationship with the foreign minister of South Korea is a woman, so that's also great. She's very smart, and you know, we need to be working a lot with the South Koreans, because you know, if we're feeling anxious about North Korea, imagine how the South Koreans are feeling right now.
So we're getting the hooks. I want a quick answer. What is NAFTA going to look like at the end of this cycle of renegotiation?
I left my crystal ball at home, but I'll tell you what the Canadian position is. Our fourth negotiating round opens tomorrow. It's in Washington. Our view about what we want to do with NAFTA is, first of all, to say Canada believes in free trade. We're a trading nation, and we believe in NAFTA, and we believe in our trading relationship with the United States. And by the way, you guys have a slight surplus with us. Just footnote there. What we'd like to do with NAFTA is modernize it. This is a 23-year-old agreement, and the economy has moved on. So there are a lot of things that sound boring, like electronic forms at the border or regulatory harmonization, that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and we're making very good progress. We would also like to make it a more progressive agreement. So we have proposed a gender chapter. We have a gender chapter in our trade agreement with Chile, and we are working to have one in our trade agreement with Israel. We've updated both of those. We'd love to do that with you guys. So maybe the world's 100 most powerful women, is that who's here?
Oh, no, we're a lot more than that. We're like 350, 400.
The 100 most powerful and friends, maybe you guys, if you think that's a good idea, let the White House know.
Great. Thank you so much, Chrystia. I'm sorry we have to cut it short.
No problem. Very nice to see you.